미국 백악관 앞에서는 이스라엘의 팔레스타인 공격을 규탄하는 대규모 시위가 열렸습니다.
유네스코는 또 동예루살렘 올드시티를 이슬람 명칭인 알샤리프라고만 지칭하며 유엔 안보리가 팔레스타인 자치령 내 이스라엘 정착촌 건설 중단을 촉구하는 결의안을 채택했습니다.
현재 이스라엘에는 이스라엘과 중동에 관한 여러 가지 사건, 사고들, 그리고 또 이스라엘의 여러 가지 재반 사항들을 기독교적인 관점에서 성경을 바탕으로 해서 해석하고 또 분석하는 그런 언론 매체가 있습니다. 바로 이스라엘 투데이라고 하는 월간지죠. 저는 오늘 이스라엘 예루살렘에 있는 이스라엘 투데이 이 본사로 찾아왔습니다. 그리고 도대체 이 매체가 어떻게 만들어지고 또 어떤 그 계획들을 갖고 있는지 이야기를 들어보기 위해서 이스라엘 투데이의 편집장이신 라이언 존스 편집장을 모시고 함께 이야기를 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 고맙습니다. 이렇게 초청해 주셔서. 이스라엘 투데이 잡지 제가 알기로도 굉장히 오래됐다라고 알고 있는데 정확하게 언제 시작됐고 또 어떤 내용을 다루는 매체인지 이스라엘 투데이에 대해서 좀 소개를 해 주시죠.
Israel Today began in the late 1970s by a German Jewish Messianic family that made Aliyah, and they realized that there was a real lack of information about what was going on in Israel from a believing perspective for the German audience. And of course this was very important because Germany was getting over what it had done to the Jews, and it needed good information about what was happening in Israel from a good perspective for the Christian audience in Germany. So they started Israel Today to feed that need.
그럼 이스라엘 투데이 잡지 주로 어떤 내용으로 채워집니까?
We cover the peace process. Obviously, this is a major topic for believers, Christians around the world that are looking at Israel. The peace process is a big issue because Christians are looking at Israel and recognizing that Israel's rebirth and restoration in our time is important, is significant to us as people who believe in the Bible, because this is a process that is basically trying to reverse the restoration of Israel, is trying to take away lands that were restored to Israel as part of this, what we recognize as this biblical process. And when the foreign media, the mainstream international media reports on this, they're obviously doing so from a very secular point of view. They're doing it from a very liberal point of view that says, that accepts the narrative that Israel is an occupier and for that reason must give back the land. The Bible doesn't enter the equation at all, and that's understandable. But for us as believers and for our readership as Christians, the Bible should very much be part of the equation. So we report on that issue in particular, on the peace process, from that perspective, from the biblical perspective. That, okay, this is the physical situation, this is the situation as the rest of the world sees it, but if we bring the Bible into the equation, we have to consider that Israel didn't come into possession of these lands by accident. This was foretold, obviously, thousands of years ago. So as Christians looking at the situation, this has to be considered. And so we try to provide that perspective, since no one else is doing it, from the ground here in Israel.
그럼 이제 아무래도 이스라엘에서 그 메시아닉 주들을 많이 만나실 텐데 메시아닉주 유대인들 입장에서 이런 잡지를 그 독일 사람들이 만드는 거에 대해서 어떻게 받아들이던가요?
So our readership is primarily abroad, primarily in Europe, North America, Korea as well. And so most of the readers are Christians, non-Jewish believers. We do also have a lot of Messianic Jewish readers who are obviously attracted to the magazine because it is a Messianic run publication. Now we do always like to stress that Israel Today is not a ministry. It is owned and operated by Messianic Jews, but it is not a Messianic Jewish ministry. It is a news agency, full stop. It is a regular Israeli news agency like every other news agency, but it is owned and operated by Messianic Jews, so obviously that influences how we look at the issues and how we cover the issues. And so this, of course, is attractive to Messianic Jews abroad who want to know more about what is happening in Israel, as well as for Christians abroad.
물론 독일 사람이 시작을 하긴 했지만 현재 뭐 우리 편집장님은 독일 분이 아니시고 미국 분이라고 이야기 들었습니다. 다른 직원들도 어떻습니까? 이스라엘 사람들, 미국 사람들, 독일 사람들 다양한 그 이 출신들이 모여서 일을 합니까?
So as I mentioned earlier, it was started in German, in the German language for the German audience in the late 1970s because that's where the need was first recognized. Since then, about 20 years after that, in the early 1990s, they began to recognize that even though there was a lot of media coverage in English, it was typically very poor coverage or very biased coverage against Israel. So they decided that they would also start the publication in English to fill the gap, let's say in English, with information and news, the same topics that everyone else was covering, but from a different perspective. So they began in English, and from there it grew into Korean, Norwegian, Dutch, and for a while also in Japanese. But it was just as different Christian audiences in different countries began to recognize that even though they were hearing about what was happening in Israel, the coverage was very biased and they were missing a particular perspective on what was happening, that we began to start different editions in different languages. And obviously brought in different additional staff, like myself. I'm American, so I know how to take what is done in German and bring it to the English-speaking, primarily American audience. So the owners and the operators of the company, let's say our editor-in-chief and most of our managers are either German. They're all Israelis. They're all Jewish Israelis, but they are either of a German background or a native Israeli background. Along with myself, there are two other English-speaking, native English speakers. I'm from America, and the other two are from South Africa. And we also have several Russian staff who primarily do the layouts and the graphical work for the magazine.
제가 그런 질문을 드린 이유는 그 이스라엘에서 일어나는 여러 가지 이제 사건이라든가 정치적인 이슈들 이런 거를 그 기사화할 때 물론 기독교적인 관점에서 성경을 바탕으로 분석하고 또 해석을 한다고는 하지만 여러 나라의 그 출신의 그 일꾼들이 모여서 하다 보면 독일에서 온 분들하고 또 이스라엘에 살고 있는 분하고 또 미국 사람하고 서로 입장이 좀 달라서 의견 충돌이 일어나거나 그러지 않을까 해서 좀 염려가 돼서 여쭤보는 겁니다.
But let's say regarding that, I myself am probably the staff member who has lived in Israel the shortest amount of time, and I've been here for 25 years. So everyone in the company is either a native-born Israeli or has lived here at least 25 years. So so even though we may have some cultural differences in our backgrounds, in our perspectives, when we approach the news, we are all coming at the news from the perspective of Israelis.
이 이스라엘 투데이 잡지가 전 세계 몇 개 언어로 몇 개 나라에서 지금 번역되고 발매되고 있습니까?
So Israel Today is published in German and English, obviously, also in Dutch and Norwegian. In the past, we had editions in Korean and Japanese, which have currently been discontinued. So it goes to all of those countries, including all of the English-speaking nations. But it is also sent to subscribers in about 85 different countries, in various different languages, whichever is most suitable for them. We have many readers across Asia in different nations who subscribe to the English edition, for instance.
어쨌든 그 이스라엘에서 일어나는 어떤 그 정치적인 사건 또는 그 이 팔레스타인이나 아랍 간의 그 갈등의 그 문제를 다룰 때 이스라엘 투데이 이 매거진의 논조는 어쨌든 이스라엘 입장에서 이스라엘을 변호하고 이스라엘을 보호하는 그런 관점에서 기사를 쓰고 있죠.
Everything that we're writing is coming from an Israeli perspective, but we're adding to it the aspect of believers. We are Israeli believer perspective. So yes, obviously when we approach the issues such as the conflict with the Palestinians, the peace process, etc., we're coming from the Israeli position, from the pro-Israel position.
이스라엘 입장에서 이스라엘을 보호하는 그런 기사를 쓰는 이스라엘 투데이의 편집장의 입장에서 봤을 때 전 세계 언론들, 특히 미국의 CNN이라든가 영국의 BBC, 다른 나라의 그 유력 언론사들이 이스라엘 이 문제를 바라보는 시각 많이 그 편향되고 왜곡되어 있다 이렇게 보시고 있는 거죠.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, one of the reasons for first starting Israel Today, first in German and then in English, was a recognition that all of the media coverage of Israel, and just to go a little bit aside here, it is amazing how much media coverage this very, very tiny country receives. And I think many estimates have noted that there are more reporters in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, foreign reporters, there are more foreign reporters in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv than anywhere else in the world besides Washington, D.C. And this is a tiny country with a tiny population, and yet it receives more media coverage than most places in the world. The problem is that most of that media coverage is very biased, is coming from a perspective of people who have an agenda. And so we began Israel Today, as I noted, to kind of counter that, to provide a different perspective, not only a perspective of believers and Israelis, but people who are actually living here on the ground. This is our home, this is where we live, this is, we serve in the army. So we have a different perspective than the foreign journalists who are coming in and reporting. You see different things happen with the peace process, with security, terrorist attacks, and we are constantly frustrated because the immediate media coverage from CNN, from BBC, from others is almost always, I would say 90% of the time, very, very biased in the initial coverage of these events. For instance, some of the recent stabbing attacks here in Jerusalem, down at the Old City, the first headlines that came out of BBC or CNN or others like these was that Israeli police officers had shot dead a Palestinian. That's all they said. Later in the article, they might mention that the Palestinian who was shot dead was stabbing someone when he was shot. But in their headline, they don't say this. So this is very frustrating because it creates a perception of Israel as aggressive, and it creates a perception that Israel is the aggressor and Israel is to blame. So we're trying to counter this. In my work, I see this oftentimes in a very up-close and personal way because I will go to press conferences or to different events around the country, as do my colleagues, and we get a first-hand look at how some of the foreign journalists who are with us at those events are choosing to cover different things. For instance, a few years ago, a colleague of mine, she traveled with a pool of reporters from the AFP, from Associated Press, from Reuters, and they traveled on a bus down to the south of Israel. This is at a time when rockets were coming from Gaza into southern Israel. And while they were on the bus going to the location, my colleague tells me that the reporters from these other agencies were sitting together on the bus and they were already deciding how they were going to portray the events that were happening. They hadn't even been there yet. They hadn't talked to any Israelis, they hadn't talked to any Palestinians, they had not witnessed the rockets themselves personally, and they were already deciding how they were going to write the headlines. A few days ago I was at a press conference and we were listening to an Australian member of parliament who was talking about the problem of foreign aid going into Gaza and being used by Hamas for terrorism. And Israel recently arrested one of these foreign charity workers because he was involved with Hamas. Well, one of the foreign media reporters at this press briefing was from the AFP. He had spoken to the lawyer of the arrested man, of the accused Hamas member. And he had decided already that Israel was to blame. He had not even heard the Australian man speak. He had not considered the evidence that was being presented in this press briefing. He had already made up his mind by speaking to the lawyer of the Hamas member. So I see these types of things all the time where the media is already deciding already has a predisposed position that Israel is to blame, and so they make the news fit that agenda.
우리 라이언스 존스 편집장님께서는 지금 10년째 이곳에서 일을 하고 계시다고 얘기하셨는데 10년 전에 이스라엘 그리고 10년 동안 쭉 이스라엘을 지내면서 지금 또 이스라엘 한 10여 년간 깊은 곳에서 이스라엘을 바라보셨습니다. 어떻습니까? 우리 편집장님께서 보시기에는 10년 전에 이스라엘에 비해서 지금 이스라엘 어떻게 변해가고 있고 그 변해가는 상황이 또 하나님의 예언 속에 하나님의 계획 속에 점점점 깊은 곳으로 이렇게 가고 있다 이렇게 느껴지십니까?
Yeah, so I've been at Israel today for 10 years and I've been in the country for almost 25 years. And just in a physical sense, you see much change. Israel's growing very fast. There are lots of, often, immigrants, Jewish immigrants coming into the country, so the population is growing, the cities are growing. Just Jerusalem where we live, we've seen it's changed physically completely in the past 20 years. And I know many people who live abroad who were here 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, and then they come back today, and it's just a different country. So Israel has explosive growth, technologically, in terms of its population, in terms of its building. In terms of its spiritual situation, let's say, I would say that 20 years ago when I first came here, Israel was at a point where it was tired of war and it was tired of terrorism, and I'm talking about the period of time where the Oslo peace process was just beginning. Israelis were tired of the violence and the terrorism, and they thought that they had found a way to solve the problem on their own, a man-made solution, let's say. And I bring my wife into this discussion because she's an Israeli Christian who grew up here. And she grew up on a small kibbutz in the south, in the Negev region. And it was a very liberal kibbutz, very secular. And they were very excited about the Oslo peace process because they felt that they, as Israelis, had figured out the problem, that they had solved the problem. And she grew up in this environment, and she was caught up in it, and she also thought, this is a wonderful thing. And now 20 years later, with Oslo having been a complete failure, with the terrorism having only increased because of the deals that were made, I use the village where she grew up, the kibbutz where she grew up, as an example because at least half of the people that she grew up with, who were secular, very liberal population, half of them today no longer support the peace process because they've realized what has happened. And as Israelis have slowly begun to realize that they didn't figure out the problem, that they didn't solve the problem, that they don't have the answers, I don't think most of them are doing it consciously, but many, many Israelis are starting to turn more towards God. Let's say Israel is becoming increasingly religious from where it was 20, 25 years ago. And I wouldn't say that most Israelis recognize why they're becoming more religious, but it is a byproduct, it is a result of them realizing that they don't have the answers to their problems. They can't solve their own problems. And as a result of that, you see a lot more reliance on God, even in an indirect way oftentimes. A few years ago, we did a survey here in the magazine, and this was at a time when the Iranian nuclear crisis was really coming to a peak. Israelis were most concerned about what was going on in Iran. And so we asked Israelis, if it comes down to a real existential threat from the Iranian nuclear program, who do you trust in to protect Israel? And we gave them 3 or 4 options: the United States, the Israeli army, or God. And we were actually, we expected for many people to choose God, but we were actually surprised that well over 50% said God. That they trust in God more than they trust in the IDF, their own army, and certainly more than they trust in America at the end of the day to protect this nation.
이스라엘 투데이 잡지에서 특히 요즘 중점적으로 이렇게 관심을 갖고 준비하거나 취재하는 그런 부분이 있으면 어떤 것들일까요?
We try to cover a fairly broad selection of the news. Obviously, there's a lot that is going on with politics and security in Israel. So we spend a lot of time on that. And we lately spend a lot more time on regional news as well because of what is going on with ISIS and the Islamic State and the Arab Spring and all of these problems. But one area where we really try to focus is within the conflict with the Palestinians, between Israel and the Palestinians, is the issue of the Arab Christians, the Palestinian Arab Christians. And we focus a lot of attention on this because there's been a real movement of late to turn those Christians against Israel. And this has been used to kind of spread abroad to Christians around the world to support these Palestinian Christians and therefore support the Palestinian cause and therefore be against Israel. It's kind of a ripple effect. So we have of late have spent a lot of attention on this because we want to stress to people in our reporting that Israel is not perfect. Israel is not always right. Israel is doing the best that it can, as any other nation would in the situation that Israel is in. But in addition to that, Christians who are looking at the situation must bring the Bible into account when they're considering the news, when they're considering what is happening in Israel. And there's been a real movement amongst Palestinian Christians, the ones that I'm talking about at least, and those who are listening to them abroad, to no longer look at Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. That Israel is just another nation, and therefore the mistakes that Israel make are on Israel, are theirs alone, and mean that Christians should not support Israel, and certainly have no biblical reason to support Israel. So we are trying to come at it from the other angle and say, it's true that Israel is not perfect. It's true that Israel makes mistakes, but every nation makes mistakes. That's true of every country. But that's not a reason for Christians to not support Israel. Christians are supporting Israel not because Israel is perfect. Christians are supporting Israel because we recognize that thousands of years ago, this incredible rebirth of this nation was already foretold, and we are privileged to live in a time that we've actually seen it happen. So this is the reason for Christians to support Israel and to get behind Israel, and even to encourage Israel to do the right thing when Israel does the wrong thing. So we do a lot of reporting on this topic because we feel that it is important, because we feel that many Christians abroad are being turned against Israel just because Israel is not perfect, and that's the wrong perspective to take.
아랍 크리스천이 점점 많이 늘어나고 있는 겁니까?
The number of Arab Christians is decreasing significantly. Bethlehem, of course, is the best example. 30, 40 years ago, Bethlehem had a majority Christian population. Today, they're very much in the minority, I think around the 15 to 10% only of the city's population. So Arab Christians are leaving as often as they possibly can. And this, and again, this is often portrayed as a problem of Israel. Israel is creating a situation that these Arab Christians cannot live in, so they leave. But the truth is, when we go and speak to many of these Christians, at least the ones who feel comfortable opening up and talking, they will tell us that the real problem is the increased Islamic influence around them, the increased Muslim extremism around them is creating a situation where they cannot live openly as Christians. And so they seek to go abroad.
어쨌든 이스라엘에 있는 이 팔레스타인 아랍 사람들 이들이 이 크리스천으로 이렇게 변하는 거 그랬을 때 그들이 이스라엘을 향해서 이 주기심을 가졌던 것들이 이제 바뀌고 이런 상황이 되면은 이스라엘 정부 입장에서도 그런 일들을 굉장히 환영할 만한 일이 아닐까 이런 생각이 드네요.
I want to make sure we differentiate here between the Arab Christians who live in Palestinian territories and the Arab Christians who live within full Israeli sovereign territory. The one place in the Middle East, the only place in the Middle East where the Christian population is growing is within sovereign Israel. Not the West Bank, not Judea and Samaria, but within sovereign Israel, the Christian population is growing. And that's because obviously they don't face the pressures that Christians in Islamic societies face. Now, it is true, and many people have brought it up, we have brought it up, many Jewish leaders within the Knesset even bring it up, that Israel can do a better job embracing the Christians, especially its own Arab Christians. It should embrace them more closely. But we have begun to see this very slowly start to happen in recent years, where Israel is actually now encouraging young Arab Christians to join the army. Arab Muslims and Christians are not required to serve in the army like Jews, but there is a growing movement to encourage the Christians that they should join the army because it will bring them into closer contact with their Jewish countrymen and it will help them to integrate more into Israeli society. And many, many young Arab Christians are answering this call. They're joining the army. Christian enlistment in the IDF has increased almost 300% in the past few years because many more young Christians want to be in the army and they want to be part of Israel. And at the same time, Israel also needs to do its part and embrace them. And it has to an extent. It needs to do more. That's true. But this is the difference, though, between the Christians within sovereign Israel and the Palestinian Christians. Obviously, Israel can only go so far in helping the Palestinian Christians because they live within the Palestinian Authority.
그러면 그 이후로는 이제 이스라엘과 이란과의 어떤 그 긴장 관계가 좀 많이 완화가 된 것이 아닐까. 그래서 그 이스라엘에서의 어떤 그 이 군사적인 긴장감 이것이 좀 많이 좀 줄어든 것이 아닌가 생각이 드는데 어떻습니까? 진짜 그렇습니까?
The interesting thing in the conflict, let's say, between Israel and Iran at the moment is that there is tremendous tension between Israel and the Iranian government. And obviously that trickles down to part of the population, but at the same time, you've seen grassroots movements both in Israel and in Iran that get onto social media and other means of advertising and express support and warmth for one another on a very grassroots level. And it needs to be remembered that in the early 1970s, before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Iran was Israel's closest ally in the Middle East. They were closer than any other countries in the Middle East. Iran was closer to Israel than it was to any of the Arab countries, any of the other Islamic countries. And so there is a history of warmth and friendship between the two countries. Even if the leadership in Iran is today hostile and even genocidal towards Israel, that kernel of friendship remains. It's still there. And there are many in Israel that feel that, I would say most in Israel still feel that if the Iranian regime can be overcome, can be changed, or whatever kind of change can take place, that friendship between Israel and Iran could be restored very quickly and very easily.
오늘 이스라엘 투데이 라이언 존스 편집장님과의 인터뷰는 현재 이스라엘의 정치적인 상황, 군사적인 그 영적인 상황을 구체적으로 이해하는 데 큰 도움이 됐고 또 우리가 어떻게 기도를 해야 될지 이스라엘에서 기도해야 될지를 알 수 있는 그런 귀한 시간이었습니다. 오늘 이야기해 주셔서 고맙습니다.
Thank you for having me.